Yeah.
This, remember you showed me this,
Mm-hmm.
Reason and Philosophy?
Yeah.
Can
I
we go
remember
over
that.
it?
Yeah, sure.
So he's talking about the highest concept. So reason and philosophy, which
Yeah.
now I understand the root of this paragraph, which is
Yeah.
the ancient Greek dichotomy between the world of appearances and reality. The world of appearances is what the senses give you, and reality is what reason gets you to, is in that dichotomy anyway. So this is the root
Yes.
of this conversation, right?
Yeah, it's a part of it, yeah. Or the Platonic versus otherwise. But yeah, that's one way to look at it.
Right.
Appearances versus reality. That like the reality is this higher concept. But if it's divorced from actually the way the world looks and the way the world is, and it's empty, like Nietzsche's suggesting. Like
Yes.
he's saying the consequence of the dichotomy, basically.
All superior values are of the first rank. All the highest concepts, that of being, absolute, goodness, truth, perfection. I can see he's referring to some kind of Platonic abstractions.
Yes, definitely.
What does it mean? Oh, he's saying that for these rationalists, all
Yeah.
superior values are of the first rank,
He's
right?
making fun of like quote unquote superior. It should
Right,
be like I would put in scare quotes to capture his meaning.
right. What does he mean? They cannot, however, be unlike one another. They cannot be opposed to one another.
Um, self call.
So they're the same, but they're
Yeah,
not
I mean,
contradict.
in a way that you can never contradict. Like they're inherently true just by definition, maybe, or maybe suggesting
Okay.
that there's no way they can. They're really equivalent. They don't. I'm not entirely clear.
Yeah, okay.
It's hard to say. Does they attend their tenants con? Oh, it's saying in a way, he's saying that in reality, none of these things are different, and they actually put it all together into this concept God. Like, oh, it's all
Uh,
the same. So God is all these things. And he's saying, oh, that's empty too.
yeah.
Like all of this is emptiness.
And then he says, the last most attenuated and emptiest thing
Which is
is
God.
is postulated as the first thing, as the absolute cause,
Yeah.
as ends realism.
It's the reason reality exists. Like God made reality, but he's just saying if the emptiest thing of all God has created reality, so it just almost sounds absurd.
Fancy humanity having to take the brain diseases of morbid cobweb spinners seriously. Oh, yeah, okay. So he's making fun of the philosophers who have a brain
Yeah.
disease. Yeah,
Yeah, because they're saying a nothing that started the reality, which
I
is
get it.
absurd.
Yeah. Okay. And now they're paying dearly for taking these cobweb
Yeah.
spinners seriously. Okay.
Yeah.
His post, I was learning about history, and post World War II, there are a lot of adaptations and ideas that came about that tried to learn from the world wars.
Yeah.
And I try to make a connection between that. So when I say that, I'll see if I can find you what I wrote down. But basically, I wrote down that, post World War II, you get multiculturalism, because I think part of it was based on, I only know the historical component. I don't know the philosophical component, but part of it is based on an interpretation of history. So you interpret the horror of the world wars, and also the horrors of American conduct in Vietnam, as refusing to accept the inherent validity of every other culture, and
Yeah.
refusing to accept their right to self-determination. And so Hitler was guilty of that, right? He didn't accept the inherent validity of every culture. And
Yes.
so, in that view, America is guilty of the same when they invaded Vietnam. They're just as guilty as Hitler. And that's why you can get someone who has a kind of I don't know how to describe this view of foreign policy, but like maybe America intervening and policing the world as fascist, because they group that with Hitler, because it's based on that particular view of history, which, you know, it has some truth in it, right? Like, because Hitler didn't accept the inherent validity of every culture. But where am I going with this? I'm saying that that's one. So multiculturalism, one root is that interpretation of history. And then you have all these other concepts and all these other developments like the United Nations, the League of Nations, and I'm sure there's a few more I'm not familiar with, but this view is like trying to make sense of how did humanity get to this point of the world wars, and there's this like sense of loss, like what do we do now, how do we act, the European Union as well came out of that. And so I try to make the connection between this period in the world where people are like, what have we done, how did we get here, what's the reason, like it's sort of, I try to make a comparison between that and Nietzsche saying God is dead and you have to reevaluate all values, we're lost, we've done something wrong.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a connection there?
Was there a question there exactly? I mean, I agree with you generally. Like, I think there is some connection with like a loss of something usually pushes on the
There's no
development of new
question.
values.
No, I was just looking for feedback
Yeah.
on the
Yeah,
maybe
I think
you were able to draw out a better connection, but I was just looking for feedback on that.
I mean, I think that's the right idea about Nietzsche saying God is dead, because he's just identifying a loss and being lost. And you need to find something new.
Right.
In a way, that is kind of what happened in the early 20th century, because the advancements of science made people really question the way things were, or they really altered their philosophy about the way things are. I mean, that seemed pretty big about the turn of the turn of the century. That was a big shift. And I think a lot of philosophy had to do with the early development of Nazism and fascism, not just strictly like, oh, Marx came up with some ideas, but different philosophers like finding the basis to fascism or the basis to different new values. Like, in a way, they've almost taken some of Nietzsche's recognitions that you need to reevaluate all values and maybe even return to old ones in a way. I mean, I don't know if that's strictly Nietzsche, but that's something that seemed to happen. Like Hegel probably had a lot to do with that too, because Hegel influenced people in many directions, both to the right and the left, as far as the usual political left and right goes. I know that was a big deal, but I'm not sure how Hegel led to the World War II. I mean, I'm sure there's a connection, and I think you're right to identify that there's like identifying that kind of change. Like, oh, like multiculturalism, people might think the lack of it is the cause of World War II. Therefore, you need to be multicultural, and therefore even say all cultures are equal, which is itself a flaw. And then you might go the other direction again later, saying, oh, since it's failed, that multiculturalism failed, then we might as well go back to what we were doing before. And that could happen too. So it's like a pendulum sometimes. Like sometimes they feed on each other. There's this feedback loop.
And is there here's what I wrote down originally. So I was trying to connect all these developments in the world to the world wars. And so in Europe, you have supranationalism. So they're trying to transcend nationalism, which caused they perceive nationalism, or so what is it, national socialism, to have been responsible for basically Germany's aggression in Europe and coming close to the self-destruction of Europe. And then there's this shift in America from making the world safe for democracy, making it safe from communism and being this police state, to it's kind of contradictory now. Like you pointed out, there people are going back to, like, some people are now, you start to see, you can see this split. There's like that I put globalization in quotation marks because there's people who are like all about globalization and trade. And then there's these people I've seen like talking about how globalization is bad. It's ruining everyone. We need to start, focusing more on ourselves, like the UK separating from the rest of Europe to become more independent again and more nationalist. And so there's this kind of like chaos, a vacuum. It's unstable, it's anarchical. And that's the connection I was trying to make to like this post framework, like where you don't know what's going on anymore. God is dead. There's no guiding, there's no values that are guiding you. You don't know what to do. And it's sort of like, as it is the case in philosophy, where God is dead and now everyone's lost. It's the same in politics.
Yeah, I think that could characterize a lot of 1900s history. I think
Right.
that being lost is characteristic of a lot of literature, even like the turn of the century, it captured something of hopelessness in people. But now it's like, I don't know where things are going exactly now, but
Yeah.
you could see that's related to philosophy, that
Yeah.
whether or not philosophy caused it, it's a harder thing to say, but Nietzsche identified it and we see it play out.
And okay, but you're not sure, like you don't think it's still a carryover, like as in Nietzsche said, is it Nietzsche or Nietzsche?
Nietzsche.
Nietzsche said this in 1800s, and so it's still, in a sense, it's still the case that God is dead, as he said.
Yeah.
By that I mean like people are lost. We're kind of like post morality, where people are. There's so many different contradictory elements and people wanting different things.
Right.
There's like some people are saying, oh, we need to go back to tradition. Like there's all these Twitter accounts that post like old families and how great it was and the glory of,
Yeah.
like women doing this and that and being traditional. And so there's this confusion, and it's still the case. So do you think we're still in this kind of state of Nietzsche's God is dead?
A lot of the time, yes.
Yeah.
I think it's still the case.
Okay. That's
In
very
some
interesting.
areas.
Yeah.
Maybe, I'm trying to think, maybe less about science
Yeah.
than it used to be.
Yeah.
But I
in
don't
the
think it's changed
humanities.
about humanities, probably not.
Okay.
It
That's
seems
very,
chaotic still.
very cool. And then so Nietzsche will offer insight into the psychology of both different kinds of historical moralities, and then what happens when you announce God is dead, right?
Yeah. And sometimes in a way he can be, Nietzsche himself is the cause of it to a degree, because some people take Nietzsche's identification as like, well, that's reality really is a mess. And I really just need to create my own meaning, which you get existentialism out of that a bit, or even literary authors. I mean, I know Nietzsche has been inspiration to many people. So in a way, he's inspired other philosophers. Like, I mean, if he inspired Carl Jung, then you could say that people can take his ideas in many directions.
Yeah.
And some people take it in a more like Foucault, who was more subjectivist about cultural values, I think. I don't know that much about him, but
yeah,
he's somebody who's been inspired by Nietzsche. So Nietzsche provides the analysis, but it's open enough that people have taken in many directions.
right. Because like you said to me, the value you gain from him are the questions you ask, and then the direction in which you take that depends on you.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche almost practically said that. Like, he doesn't even care what you take from it, just as long as you think about it. It seems like that's all he actually cared about.
Yeah.
Even if you even so that people are probably going to completely misinterpret me, and I just accept that. He even said that about himself.
Yeah. I was thinking about, like you can, often there are great thinkers, but even great thinkers, like they may make errors which they later change their mind on in their life as they, so if you had, for example, imagine Aristotle died when he was 30. Like what works would we have, as opposed to, let's say he died when he was 150.
Yeah.
And he was still active minded. Or imagine, Ayn Rand 200, or Nietzsche if he lived
Yeah.
and he didn't have any medical issue and he lived until he was like 160, like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't know if that thought has any value, but okay.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting to think like, I think what Rand wanted to study more of was neuroscience and math to help her philosophy. Peikoff mentioned that, but she was only really old at that time. So
Yeah.
it's not like she could have done much. But I really do wonder what insight she may have had if she just had that more time.
Yeah. Okay. She was already, though. The hard thing is that you can have the philosophy or you can have it consciously, but as as Morpheus says in the Matrix, to know the path and walk the path are different. And if you don't have it implicitly from the beginning, and she had a lot of it implicitly from the beginning, which is evident in the fountainhead, right?
I think so.
And so it's difficult then. Imagine if you're a Keating and then you change your mind, you're still in a sense a Keating. It's like, it's so difficult to reverse that. Yeah,
there's no inner truth to that.
You said last tutorial you started talking about consistency. Do you remember this was in the context of a discussion about social experiencing Heraclitus's flux in a social context? And then you mentioned this and I said we'd pick it up. So do you want to expand on?
I meant in the context of, say, when there's chaotic social relationships, whether they're abusive relationships or abusive households, your mind is constantly put in the face of inconsistency in ways you can't even generalize much from, because one moment to the next is different. Right. And that is in fact the case. It's not like the facts about reality. It's not like the facts about, I don't know, how trees grow are ever going to change day to day, but this is human behavior we're talking about. And people can deliberately be inconsistent. And when their behavior is frequently inconsistent, then you can't really make any principles out of it. And then who knows what happens as being a child. Because a child, you might not realize, oh, this only applies to people. You might accidentally start thinking, well, everything in reality is this unpredictable. A tree could grow, but it might stop growing randomly. There's no way to know. Because just like my parents, why would a tree grow consistently?
Right. Yeah, I guess that's embodied in a kind of terror and fear. A fundamental fear you have of things going wrong and so on.
But it is known that some people can overcome that. And it's not easy to explain. How is it that some people don't manage to get out of that without significant issues, while some others manage to get out of it and do perfectly fine? So that's a curious thing. Like, how do you go through that without falling into some Heraclitean madness?
You're making me think of, I was reading an interview no, here we go. I found it. Let's see. You're right. It is interesting that, okay, on the one hand, you get some people let's say the majority, if we're just looking at it statistically, I don't know what the case is, but statistically, the majority might come out badly out of a very unstable, unpredictable household, whether there's abusive parents or something like that. But some people don't.
Yeah.
And so you remind me of, I'm going to find this quote. Let's see. Okay, yeah, it's from Quincy Jones. I think he had a bad childhood, but he said this.
Yeah.
And so he's an example of someone who I think came out of that and managed to thrive.
Yeah. I think implicit in that statement is that he recognizes that this isn't like a permanent state of reality. He recognizes there's something in particular that's different. It's not, reality is not this way. It's just these people are acting in a way that I can fix it. It's not my problem.
Very interesting. It would be great if, I don't know, psychology is still very like there's a lot of advancements in, like, for example, cognitive biases or some
Yeah.
general kinds of ideas on how people behave, but less so on, like, okay, therapeutic intervention. How do you then enact? How do you then achieve a complete transformation in personality? Like, there's less of that, and I think that's why there's also a lot of interest in, a lot of people I meet are very interested in Jung, depending on, like, if I'm in any sort of intellectual group or discussion, like, a lot of people are interested in Jung, and I think part of it is that reason. Like, he's got this appeal of, like, there's some kind of magical transformation you can go through. I don't quite get a lot of what he says because it's vague,
Yeah.
but I think it has that appeal for that reason. It's filling in a vacuum that is not, I don't know if psychology's really developed it. Yes, there's CBT, but that's kind of helps you
Yeah.
change isolated issues, but not
Mhm.
holistically.
I think that's a fair evaluation.
Yeah. Okay. So should we go into, now that we've covered psychology, should we go into, let's go, oh, actually, I've got some random questions as well. So let's do that before we go into history of philosophy.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on grammar for thinking or clarity for like, not clarity for communication, but I'm thinking specifically for thought.
You mean like studying the rules of grammar?
Yeah.
I haven't thought much about it. I mean, I know good grammar is important,
I know for
but
communication, there are definitely, like, the dangling participle. I'll often read something and you don't know what they're talking about.
I mean, sometimes I found use somewhat indirectly when I've learned another language. Like I see
Right.
the grammar rules like a subject, verb,
Yeah.
predicate, whatnot. Sometimes helps me distinguish what I'm doing when I'm writing, but it's not that much mileage I get
Yeah.
from it. I think I've never found much use in studying it other than really just say syntax, I guess is fine, but that's syntax and like word order and things like that
Yeah.
might be useful, but I don't know any way to study grammar.
Little mileage, so it doesn't matter for now.
But I mean, if you can write grammatically, of course, that was subject to clarity, but I'm not sure if learning the clarity will provide, or learning the grammar will provide the clarity you need. I mean, I think it's more a matter of how you organize your ideas.
Yeah.
Then the grammar should naturally come out of it.
Yeah. Do you think if I is, I guess, if I use a concept in a proposition, is that a form of integration?
Um, Not necessarily. I mean,
Hmm.
you're not necessarily integrating the concepts. You could be talking about them. You could be
Yeah.
talking about the concept in the preposition. You could have a concept in the preposition that, or proposition that, well, it depends what's the subject of your discussion, what's the predicate of the discussion. I'm using that, maybe that's not a great term to use, but it depends whether something is, you're saying something about a concept, or you're, the subject of the proposition is the concept. I mean, you can distinguish between saying, pointing out a subject versus what you say about a subject. So I mean, you could say dog is a subject, but you're saying about the dog that ran after the bird. You don't necessarily need to integrate anything other than to integrate in the sense that the ran after the bird refers to dog. I mean, maybe that sense you could say it's integrated,
Right.
but is it integrated in the sense of knowledge? I mean, does it say anything about running after birds has anything to do with dogs? Not necessarily, or it could be ad hoc. Like, sure, a dog ran after a bird, but it doesn't say anything more than in this instance at this time, in this place, this happened.
Yeah.
It's nothing more universal or abstract.
Okay.
but saying like basic grammar, like recognizing that and then reflecting on it might be useful sometimes. Like actually recognize what's the subject of your sentence, what's the predicate of the sentence. Are you clear about what's what? Are you clear about which is the distinction of two subjects? Are you clear when you start a new clause versus continuing the same idea? Things like that can help you realize if you're being clear. Like whether or not you intend something to be two ideas or one idea.
Yeah, because I saw that. The reason I brought it up is one, there's a professor called Richard Mitchell who writes a lot about the role that grammar plays in thinking, not in, obviously it's useful for communicating clearly, but he writes a lot about thinking, and he talks, but yeah, I wasn't able to quite, like, it sounds good, but I wasn't quite able to relate it to, maybe it is the case of mileage, like there's just not that much mileage in it, but anyway, it's not that important.
Yeah.
What did I want to ask you? Going back actually to what we discussed about psychology and my evaluation of it, which you thought was fair. Do you think there's, like one thing I'm realizing in studying philosophy, even if you read fiction, which is supposed to give you an embodied abstraction, like, in Genesis, how God breathes into the nostril of the clay and the clay becomes alive. So the art breathes into the artist is like God breathing into the nostrils of the abstraction and it becomes alive too. Like even with that, it's not enough necessarily to cause a kind of very fundamental change in someone. And do you think part of the reason there's all this interest in, like, because Brandon in his book mentioned radix. I don't know if you've heard about that.
No.
Radix. He's mentioned a lot of, like, and now there's this book that I was a few weeks ago, I was invited to a discussion. I didn't go to it, but it was on a book called The Body Keeps the Score. You heard of that one?
Sounds familiar, but I'm not sure.
Okay, it's written by a psychologist, and it's about how trauma, which I don't exactly know what trauma is, but something bad is your body. It's stored in your body in some form, as opposed to stored in conscious terms. I guess we could say it's emotional. It's
Usually
not
abuse
experienced,
or like PTSD sort of things.
right? And it is the case that you can develop very good skills at thinking, and you can think very well when you set your mind to some specific aspect of reality that you want to dissect. But then it, in a sense, isn't like, to embody it and live up to something is like a completely different challenging task. And then part of the interest in psychology and radix and the body keeps score and all this might be trying to get at that fact that a lot of who we are is kind of it's implicit. It's not, unfortunately there's no like explicit words stored in my subconscious that I'm like, oh, let me just correct this badly structured loop in my mind and rewrite the code for this. It's like, it's a different, there's something else going on we don't know yet. We don't have enough knowledge to change it. That's my take on what's going on in psychology now.
Well, that is Rand's idea of like the subconscious is the constant recorder of everything in your life,
right?
In scientific terms, or
she's
more clear terms.
Yeah, she says that, but she also says that sense of life is non-volitional. Well, I don't know if she says that directly, but she says it's preconceptual. If it's, to me, if it's preconceptual, it's non-volitional to some extent. And so everyone is kind of left stuck with a partial imprint of their culture and their family and all that. And psychology doesn't yet have the technology to change that, I think, in a significant way.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I mean, that's so difficult to deal with because it's not any choice in the sense of like you want to feel that way, but it could be like well, I don't really want to say like tiny little choices, but nothing that's really culminates in like, oh, I totally meant to develop this sense of life.
Yeah.
You could only break it down to tiny pieces, like, and
Yeah.
that's really hard to analyze.
I
I'm
agree.
not even sure how you could. Even as a scientist, I don't even know how you investigate whether it's even true that there is such a thing. Like, it seems right, but I don't know how you investigate it other than to say that it seems apparent that there are aspects of our personality that have developed long before we even could articulate what we even think ourselves to be, or to
Yeah.
articulate what we care about.
Yeah. Another reason for my interest in that is in studying more and more philosophy, I do realize that as like if you reflect on your day, and we had this discussion a while ago, and I was trying to understand, okay, is it really true that ideas guide all actions? And the truth is, implicitly maybe, but they're not in a sense they're not ideas, because you can experience a large portion of your day not as a conscious decision making process, but as a kind of riding on past automated or riding on past automations. I don't like that word automation, but you know what I'm saying, right? Like you're kind of riding on something that it doesn't have. Even if you wanted to put words on it, you'd have to try and find words and concepts that are applicable, but you didn't reason yourself into it necessarily. It's kind of like carryover behavior.
I think sometimes that's the case.
Yeah.
And sometimes,
Yeah.
I mean, as we've talked about before, it depends how close in time the event, the action is to the idea. And they could be more proximal. They could be
Yeah.
more distal.
I
As I
agree.
always mentioned, like about like going to open the refrigerator door. I mean, that could stem from, you would say it stems from an idea you just had, but probably nothing to do with anything you thought about years ago. But
Right.
maybe to some extent it would. Maybe the way you've thought about your health led you to come to this point today where you wanted a turkey sandwich with too much mayonnaise on it, which would be
Yes.
against your health, which is almost like really distant connection.
Yeah.
But in that sense, you could say the idea of I don't care about my health leading to this point that you're getting this sandwich, but you wouldn't normally say, oh, that idea caused this idea you had years ago caused this now. It seems very distant, but so it really depends in what sense, how long
Yeah.
range you consider ideas to apply. If all we can do is think of an idea for that affects the next moment, then yeah, it doesn't matter what you think today. It won't matter 8 years down the line. But maybe you could say that certain ideas can have that effect
They do.
long term.
They do.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't know if there's much more we can get out of that, because it's such a undeveloped
Right.
area.
Yeah, I don't even have much more to say than that.
Yeah,
Actually.
me neither. It interests me because it's cool. Like that's like the coal face of, it's like the part, well, I don't know if it's the coal face, but of philosophy, but it's like that is where some of the potentially more powerful applications are, but we don't. Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway, okay, let's
I
move on
think so.
because we don't have anything,
Yeah.
or I don't have any more to say like you.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's go back 3,000 years. So Parmenides and Heraclitus, and this dichotomy between the world or reality and the world of appearances. Would you say they're both rationalists? That's what they're described as, both epistemologically rationalists. But is it fair to say that Parmenides sides slightly more with reason? Because Parmenides denies change, but change, you can see change in the world. But Heraclitus is like, well, there is change. I can see it. I'm seeing it. I'm generalizing from this change. And then I'm siding with reason and saying that everything else is an illusion. And so they're both rationalists, but on the one hand, Parmenides is like completely like nothing. I'm not looking at anything in reality.
I
in the
don't think
world of
there's,
okay, sorry.
maybe you could say one prefers or likes the idea of reason, but I think they both equally reject it. I
Okay.
mean, I want to say that I'm trying to say that even though Parmenides might be more like what you traditionally think of as reason in the Kantian sense, that you're contemplating something. If you completely deny something that's perceptually obvious, that things change, could you possibly be siding on reason in any sense? Like he's denying a critical part completely. Like how can you say you're using reason if you've completely
I'm
denied your use of the senses?
I'm using reason in this sense of the Greek dichotomy, not in an objectivist sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Greeks probably would say you're probably right that Parmenides is more on the side of reason because he tried to find the truth in inherent truth.
Yeah.
But I guess it depends actually. The Greeks didn't really use the word reason exactly. They had like two different words, I think, which isn't strictly what we would use when we say reason.
Oh, okay.
I think one sense of it was like a vision of the world, like not merely just using reason, but like an overarching look at things, which could make sense of, which would be more an integrated sort of thing where, but the Greeks sort of have a different concept even than what we would usually mean by reason.
Okay. Is it the case that skeptics today are still partially based on Heraclitus?
I would still say so, yeah.
Wow.
For, I mean, it seems like the basic way to describe skepticism is that everything's changing. How do we know? It seems everything boils down to that at some level, I think,
Wow.
if you're skeptical. And maybe we could say Parmenides is more on the side of reason because he's at least trying to find order in an otherwise what he thinks is a chaotic world. So at least he put an effort in. While Heraclitus is like, I'm not even trying.
No, but I meant in the sense of, yeah, I guess they didn't have the word reason, so that's where
There's a difference.
you
I mean,
weren't clear. But I meant in the sense of, for the Greeks, they can learn about reality through the senses, or they can learn about the world of they can learn about reality through reason or the world of the senses in their dichotomy. I'm trying to get inside their dichotomy, or they can learn about the world of appearances through the senses. So the reality through reason, world of appearances through the senses. And what I noticed is that they're both on the side of reason in the Greek dichotomy, but Parmenides isn't looking out into the world. He simply says, what is, what is not, is not. You cannot speak about what is not. And then he goes on to make all these deductions, whereas Heraclitus looks out into the world and sees a flowing river. He sees water turning to ice melting. He sees change. He's using his senses to identify change. And from that, he generalizes. So he then goes on to reason and he sides with his reasoned conclusion. But there's still some kind of, there's more of that looking out into the world, and there's less that, you know what I'm saying? Does that make more sense? I
yeah,
don't
I
know.
think for the most part, you're right. I
Okay,
think
got it.
in the sense of the Greek dichotomy and what I know about the way they use the term reason. I mean, they had a word for it, but it didn't exactly the same connotation. But I'm not going to get into that. I mean, you're
Yeah,
right,
that's okay.
though. I think you're saying I don't need
Do you
to get
know,
into that linguistic distinction.
when I listen to this, I could put myself in that context, and I don't think I'd be able to get out of this dichotomy, because
Yeah,
these arguments in that context at that time are difficult. If someone said to you, "Hey, look at me, like this match," it's well, I don't know, there weren't matches back then, but you could, or a seed, look at this seed that has turned, look at this acorn that has turned into an acorn tree. It's an acorn seed, but it also isn't an acorn seed. And you're like, yeah, that's true. It's a contradiction. It is and it isn't. Like, it's not easy to get out of that dichotomy in that context.
I'm not sure if you got to this part of the lectures yet, but basically Peacock was saying that Plato in a way said, you guys are both right, but it'll give you guys each your own separate world. The Platonic world goes to Parmenides. The real world goes to Heraclitus. Therefore, we can both be right. You're all right. We just get a separate world for each of you. And that's kind of goes to Plato. But Aristotle in a way said that you're both right in a way, but we got to integrate into one reality. You don't get two separate worlds for each of us. You have to integrate it together. That you both made a correct observation, but we need to keep them together, integrate them somehow. And that's how Aristotle and Plato differ.
I just got up to Pythagoras, which is which feeds into the Pythagorean view is what Plato picked up and what you just described, where there's the world of numbers and then there's the world of appearances.
Yeah. And he just answered them by saying like, well, you're both right and you get a separate world each.
Yeah, you each get your own reality. Yeah.
Yes. That's basically what he did.
Yeah. I enjoyed listening to him explain it that way. Very, very funny. Okay. Maybe we can fit in one more question. I'd like to ask you about these philosophical divisions, the ancient, medieval, the modern, the postmodern. I'm only up to Pythagoras, by the way, so that just so you know. So, okay, I understand within the ancient, there's pre-Socratics, then there's Socrates and Plato, and then you get Aristotle, post-Aristotelian. Now, when you get onto medieval, the Renaissance is like the tail end of medieval. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
But it's
I would
medieval.
still add the Roman philosophers in there, like Cicero and those.
I think, are they post-Aristotelian? I think
I guess you could say that. I'm not sure what term they would go under. I would just call them Roman then. That's how I distinguish in my head.
But are these divisions logical in the sense that they're not just based on time? Are they based on actual problems that were essential to the time? Like,
yes, I could say that Cicero built on a lot of things Aristotle said about rhetoric and memory and epistemology, I think. And that was an advancement on Aristotle, a lot of what he wrote. And it did influence the philosophical discourse of the time. And even he worked in the Senate. So he had a bearing on the political climate as well. So it's not just saying that, there's just these philosophers who were Roman and they had cool ideas, but they actually took their ideas and probably had some bearing on the politics and the culture in a very direct way.
When we speak of post as a prefix, post can mean there's a vacuum left over, like you've rejected what was before.
Yeah, or it could just simply mean after. Well, that connotation just comes from like postmodern thinking, like after Nietzsche is also really usually pretty generally seen as postmodern. I mean, not a fine distinction, but it's after the modern world, and therefore, which is usually characterized as a loss of meaning or a view of chaos or something like that, or uncertainty brought on about the modern world.
Okay, right. So you have, I don't know, I haven't gotten to modern, so I don't know what characterizes that time of thought. But when you go from modern to postmodern, which you roughly drew that distinction as Nietzsche, saying God is dead, that's different from when you speak of like post-Aristotelians, right? Like they're building on Aristotle versus when
it's
we
just
go
saying
from
after in those cases.
Okay, got
really
it. So
after.
The meaning of the prefix actually changes in these divisions, right? So you have postmodern, modern, but then when you have like Aristotelians and post-Aristotelians, it's not the same thing as modern, postmodern. It's not like the post-Aristotelians rejected Aristotle and now like, oh, what do we do now? That's different. Okay.
I mean, the word is taken on that connotation sometimes.
Okay.
Like, I mean, yeah, it just means after, but sometimes the connotations with postmodern and like, say philosophers like Foucault and things like that, that's when people start thinking like, oh, like post science fiction could be like not just after, but like a complete dismantling of the normal understanding of science fiction or it could mean a dismantling and meaninglessness, but that's just a connotation. It's not. I mean,
Okay.
it originates still from just saying after, but
Okay.
it takes on a
Okay.
whole
Got
other
it.
meaning in the modern context, in our
Got it.
contemporary context.
Okay. Interesting. All right. Well, let's